hold this image in your mind. A massive iron bell, suspended high above a hospital ward, not in a church tower, not in a city square, but inside a place meant for the sick. The walls are stone, the ceilings stretch upward far beyond what any practical design would require. Sunlight pours through tall arched windows, illuminating rows of patients lying beneath something that doesn't feel like a medical facility at all. It feels like a cathedral. And then the bell rings. Not randomly, not to mark time, but for them, for the patients. Now, here's the part no one ever told you. Almost every hospital built before the year 1900 looked like this. Monumental structures, carefully designed spaces, buildings that seemed less concerned with containing disease and more focused on creating an environment that did something to the human body. And then, within a single generation, they were all gone. Not abandoned, not slowly replaced, not gradually modernized, gone, demolished, erased, rebuilt from the ground up. Across Paris, London, Vienna, Philadelphia, Cape Town, McCall, New Orleans, different countries, different governments, different cultures, same outcome. The official explanation says this was progress, that medicine advanced, that old hospitals were primitive, unsanitary, dangerous relics of a less enlightened time. But if that were true, the transition wouldn't look like this. It wouldn't be synchronized, it wouldn't be systematic, and it definitely wouldn't involve the complete disappearance of something as specific as those bells, because here's where the story breaks. These weren't small bells used to signal meals or shift changes. They were massive, resonant, built directly into the architecture of the hospital itself, integrated into the very spaces where patients were treated. Which raises a question no textbook ever asks. Why would a building designed only to treat illness require a sound system powerful enough to fill an entire structure with low-frequency vibration? And why, when these hospitals were demolished, did those bells disappear with them? Not preserved, not documented, not explained, just gone. If this was simply the evolution of medicine, there should be a record of debate, a transition, a disagreement between old methods and new. But instead, history does something far more unsettling. It skips. One system vanishes, another appears fully formed in its place, and in between, silence. So the real question isn't just what changed. The real question is this: what were those hospitals actually doing before someone decided the entire world needed to forget? Let's start with what we're told, because that's where the first fracture appears. We're told that hospitals before the year 1900 were primitive, overcrowded charity wards, poorly ventilated buildings where infections spread easily and the poor were sent to die. That as science advanced, these outdated structures were naturally replaced by modern, efficient medical institutions. It sounds reasonable, until you look at what actually happened. Because if this were a natural evolution, the transition would have been uneven. Some cities would resist change, some buildings would be repurposed, others would remain standing for decades, slowly phased out as newer methods proved themselves. That's how progress normally works. But that's not what we see here. What we see instead is near total removal. Across multiple continents within the same narrow window of time, the old hospitals didn't fade out. And what remains, what little survived, tells a very different story. Take the Hotel Dieu in Paris, officially founded in the 7th century, and still standing into the 19th century as a vast cathedral-like medical complex on the Isle de la Cité. Arched corridors, towering chambers. A structure so massive and intricate it resembled something built for ceremony, not emergency care. And embedded within it, a bell tower directly connected to the healing wards. It was demolished and rebuilt in the year 1878. The original structure, gone, now moved to London. Bethlehem Royal Hospital, known as Bedlam, not a crude facility, not a temporary shelter, but an architectural landmark so elaborate that visitors traveled across Europe just to walk through it. A place designed with symmetry, scale, and presence that far exceeded what would be necessary for basic medical treatment. It too was moved, rebuilt, Its original structure repurposed, its original design abandoned, then Edinburgh, the Royal Edinburgh Asylum, then Philadelphia, Pennsylvania Hospital, then Cape Town, Grodesure, then Porto, then Macaw. Different regions, different political systems, same pattern. Massive, ornate, over-engineered structures, all removed, replaced, or fundamentally altered within the same historical window. And here's where it becomes impossible to ignore. Every single one of them had bells, not decorative additions, not symbolic features, functional components of the structure itself. Large bells, sometimes multiple, built into towers or mounted directly into the architecture of the healing spaces. Not in adjacent chapels, not in administrative buildings, inside the medical complex, which forces a question that should have been asked a long time ago. What function did those bells actually serve? Because the official explanation doesn't hold. We're told they were used for timekeeping, to signal shifts, meals, administrative routines, but that explanation begins to collapse the moment you compare it to the scale and placement of the bells themselves. These were not small utility bells. They were large, resonant, low-frequency instruments, capable of filling entire structures with sustained vibration. You don't build something like that just to announce lunchtime. And then a document surfaces. An entry from the year 1847, written by a hospital administrator in Edinburgh. A facility that would later be demolished in the year 1902, its records scattered across multiple archives, most of them never digitized. The journal doesn't describe bells as signals, it describes them as treatment. According to the administrator, the bells were rung at specific times, for specific patients suffering from what the time referred to as nervous disorders. Chronic pain, conditions we might now label as neurological. The tones were not random, they followed patterns, and the administrator noted something that should stop you cold. The results were better than the chemical treatments available at the time. He wasn't speculating, he was comparing outcomes, which leads to a question that becomes harder to ignore with every piece of evidence you uncover. What exactly were those bells doing to the human body? Once you see that first crack, you start noticing it everywhere. Because that journal from Edinburgh is not an isolated anomaly. It's a fragment of a much larger pattern, one that repeats across countries, languages, and completely separate medical systems, all describing something that shouldn't exist if the official story were complete. In Vienna, an institutional record from the year 1863 describes what it calls tonal treatments. Not metaphorical language, not poetic description, direct reference to sound used intentionally in a medical setting. The building itself would later be demolished in the year 1911. No surviving documentation explains what those treatments actually involved, just the reference and then silence. Now move to Macau, a Portuguese colonial hospital, demolished in the year 1904. Records preserved not by the state, but by a Catholic missionary organization, described the use of large resonating vessels in the treatment of fever and what they called disorders of the vital energy. Resonating vessels, not pills, not surgery. Then New Orleans, a charitable hospital destroyed by fire in the year 1887 under circumstances that were never fully investigated. A former patient, writing years later, describes waking each morning to the sound of bells echoing through the ward, and noticing that her recovery from a condition her physician had called incurable began accelerating during her time there. Again, not theory, observation, anecdotal, yes, but consistent. And that consistency is where the problem begins. Because once you start collecting these accounts from Edinburgh, Vienna, Macau, New Orleans, you're no longer looking at coincidence. You're looking at a system that was never formally documented, but left behind traces in personal journals, institutional records, and scattered memoirs. And then, just as quickly as those traces appear, they stop. But here's where things take a darker turn. Because when you try to follow the physical evidence, the actual instruments, the bells themselves, you hit something that doesn't feel like absence. It feels like obstruction. The bells from pre-1900 hospitals are almost entirely unaccounted for, not rare, not partially preserved, almost completely missing. In some demolition records, there are brief notes stating that the bells were removed and sold. Sold to whom? No answer, no paper trail. In other cases, the record becomes even more precise and far more unsettling. The bells were melted down, not individually, not sporadically, but in waves, coordinated waves. The first wave aligns almost perfectly with the demolition of the hospitals themselves. Buildings come down, bells come down with them. Some are relocated briefly, most are destroyed, and then comes the second wave, World War I. Across Britain, France, Belgium, the United States, and beyond, governments begin collecting metal for the war effort. Citizens are encouraged, and in some cases legally required, to surrender metal objects. And among those objects, bells are specifically targeted. Thousands of them. Large bells, low-frequency bells. The official explanation is simple: wartime necessity, resource scarcity, industrial demand. But look at the timing. By the early 1900s, most of the original hospital structures had already been demolished or rebuilt, which means the bells being collected during these wartime drives were the survivors. The remaining pieces, the ones that hadn't already been removed, and they were taken all at once, melted, repurposed, erased, and the few that weren't destroyed ended up in museums, stripped of their context, relabeled as church bells, civic bells, decorative artifacts. No mention of where they originally hung, no explanation of what they were used for, just objects disconnected from their function, which raises a question that becomes harder to ignore the deeper you go. If these bells were nothing more than simple tools for timekeeping, why remove them so completely? Why not preserve them as part of medical history? Why not document their use? Why does every path you follow, every record you examine, lead to the same outcome? Removal, silence, and a system that appears to have been deliberately concluded. At this point, you're left with two possibilities. Either all of this is coincidence, or something about those systems, those buildings, those bells, was understood well enough by someone to justify removing them completely. And that's where modern research begins to intersect with something the 19th century never fully explained: frequency. Researchers today studying acoustic therapy and resonance medicine have repeatedly identified a specific range of sound that appears to interact with the human body in measurable ways: low, sustained, harmonically complex tones, roughly in the range of 40 to 200 Hz. Not music, not noise, but vibration, tuned to a level where it begins to affect biological systems, cellular processes, even neurological states. Some researchers suggest these frequencies overlap with the body's own natural repair mechanisms. Now, set that aside for a moment, because this is where the connection becomes difficult to ignore. The tonal range of large pre-industrial bells, the kind installed in hospitals before the year 1900, falls almost exactly within that same range. Not approximately, not occasionally, consistently, across different regions, different foundries, different architectural traditions, the same range, which raises a question no official record seems interested in asking. Was this accidental? Or was it intentional? Because if those bells were tuned, even roughly, to frequencies that influence the human body, then the architecture surrounding them begins to look very different. The high vaulted ceilings, the long corridors, the stone materials, the open courtyards. These aren't just aesthetic choices, they're acoustic environments, structures designed to carry, amplify, and sustain vibration, which means the hospital itself may not have been a passive container for treatment. It may have been the treatment, an environmental system, a machine built out of space, sound, and proportion, interacting directly with the people inside it. And then, around the turn of the 20th century, that entire model disappears, replaced by something fundamentally different. And here is where the historical record becomes much more concrete, because in the year 1910, a document is published in the United States that reshapes the entire medical system almost overnight. The Flexner Report, written by Abraham Flexner, a man with no medical degree, funded and supported by powerful private institutions. He traveled across the country, evaluating medical schools, and his conclusion was decisive. Most of them were inadequate. Within a decade, more than half of American medical schools were closed, not reformed, closed. And the ones that survived shared a common characteristic. They aligned with a new model of medicine, a model based on chemical intervention, standardized treatments, pharmaceutical compounds, institutional licensing. And here's what quietly disappears during that same period: botanical medicine, homeopathy, hydrotherapy, electrotherapy, and anything else that could not be easily standardized, patented, or controlled. Now pause there, because this is not speculation, this is documented history. But the question it raises is rarely asked. Was this shift purely scientific, or was it also economic? Because the treatments that were removed share one critical trait: they are difficult to monopolize. A plant grown in a garden, water used in a controlled environment, sound produced by a physical instrument. These are not products you can easily patent. They are systems, accessible systems, decentralized systems, and they don't require a continuous supply chain of manufactured substances. Now compare that to what replaced them: pharmaceutical compounds, produced in controlled facilities, distributed through regulated institutions, prescribed through licensed professionals. A system where every treatment flows through a controlled channel, and suddenly, the shift from environmental healing to chemical intervention doesn't just look like progress, it looks like a transition, a replacement. And if that's true, then the demolition of the old hospitals and the removal of the bells wasn't just architectural, it was foundational. Because once the buildings were gone, there was nowhere left for the old system to exist. Now step back and look at the scale of what would have been required for all of this to happen, because this is where the official explanation begins to strain under its own weight. For the global medical infrastructure to transform the way it did within such a narrow window of time, several things would have to be true all at once. Physicians in Paris, London, Berlin, Vienna, New York, Buenos Aires, Sydney, Bombay, all independently concluding that their existing hospitals were obsolete. At the same time, governments across completely different political systems, monarchies, republics, colonial administrations, emerging democracies, all independently deciding to allocate massive resources to demolish and rebuild those institutions. On the same timeline, architects across continents, all agreeing that the defining features of these older buildings, the ceiling heights, the acoustic properties, the integrated bell systems, were unnecessary, irrelevant, not worth preserving. And all of this happening without a single documented global conference, no central directive, no recorded agreement, no manifesto explaining why this shift needed to happen. Everywhere at once. The official explanation says this is simply how correct ideas spread, that once better methods are discovered, the world naturally aligns around them. But there's a problem with that, because ideas don't just spread, they require infrastructure. They require funding. And when you follow that funding, the pattern becomes much clearer. In the United States, the same institutions that supported the Flexner Report were also funding the restructuring of medical education, the lobbying for licensing laws, and the early development of pharmaceutical companies that would supply the new system. This is documented, not hidden, but rarely connected. And once you connect it, another question emerges. Did this coordination only apply to building the new system, or did it also extend backward to removing the old one? Because if you were designing a new model of medicine, one based on chemical intervention, you wouldn't just introduce it, you would eliminate competing systems, you would remove alternative methods, you would dismantle the environments where those methods were practiced, and most importantly, you would erase the physical evidence that those systems ever worked. Between roughly the year 1880 and the year 1910, across continents, across cultures, across political boundaries, the same types of buildings are removed, the same types of practices disappear, and the same types of instruments, the bells, are systematically destroyed. That level of symmetry doesn't happen by accident. But this is where the investigation moves into territory that most historians avoid, because the further back you look, the less stable the official record becomes. There are buildings still standing today, across Europe, North America, and beyond, that appear older than their documented construction dates. Structures with architectural features that don't match the technology they were supposedly built with. Buildings with sublevels, entire lower floors, that appear in original plans, but are described in later records as having been filled in during early 20th century infrastructure projects. And then there are the photographs. The earliest images we have of many 19th century buildings often show them already aged, already worn, already settled into the ground, as if they had been there far longer than the official timeline suggests. And when you examine the records of the hospitals that were demolished, you begin to notice something even more unusual. In many cases, there are operational records, patient logs, staff rosters, supply invoices, detailed documentation of how the building functioned, but no construction records, no founding documents, no architectural plans showing how the building was originally built. They simply appear in the record fully operational, as if their origin was never meant to be examined. Now combine that with everything else: acoustic systems embedded in the architecture, bells tuned to specific frequency ranges, structures designed around environmental interaction, and then total removal, which raises a possibility that is difficult to prove, but even harder to dismiss. What if these buildings weren't originally built by the same system that demolished them? What if they were inherited? And what if the wave of demolition that swept across the world in the late 19th century wasn't just replacing outdated hospitals, but erasing the last functional remnants of a much older and much less understood system? And this is where the investigation reaches the edge of what can be comfortably explained. Because once you accept the possibility that these structures may have been inherited, not originally built by the same system that later removed them, a new layer of questions begins to surface. Questions that historians rarely engage with directly. Questions that sit just outside the boundary of what is considered acceptable to study. You'll hear a word come up in that space: Tartaria. Now, this is where precision matters. Because the claim is not that Tartaria was a clearly defined empire with a capital city and a flag, neatly documented in the way modern nations are. That's not the argument. The argument is observational. Across Europe, across North America, across parts of Asia, there exist buildings, including many that were used as hospitals before the year 1900, that do not fit cleanly into the timeline assigned to them. Structures with architectural complexity, acoustic behavior, and material scale that appear inconsistent with the official narrative of when and how they were built. And when researchers begin comparing notes, they find recurring anomalies. Buildings with sublevels that appear to have been buried, foundations that sit deeper than expected, lower floors that have windows partially underground, as if the ground level itself had changed. In many city records, these changes are attributed to infrastructure upgrades in the early 20th century, street raising projects, urban development. But the documentation is often incomplete, and the pattern repeats too consistently to ignore. Now bring this back to the hospitals, because the pre-1900 medical structures fit directly into this pattern. Massive buildings, acoustically active environments, equipped with systems, bells, resonant chambers, spatial proportions that suggest a relationship between sound, structure, and the human body. And yet, none of these systems appear in any formal medical textbook, no standardized curriculum, no preserved methodology, just fragments, references, traces that something existed, but was never fully recorded, or was recorded and then removed, which leads to a possibility that is uncomfortable, but increasingly difficult to dismiss, that what was erased in the late 19th and early 20th century was not simply an outdated form of medicine, but the final visible layer of a much older knowledge system, a system that understood something about frequency, resonance, and the built environment that we do not currently understand. Or perhaps more accurately, something we are no longer taught to understand. Because once that system was removed, once the buildings were demolished, once the bells were melted, And once the new model of medicine was fully established, there was no infrastructure left for the old knowledge to survive. No institutions, no official records, no recognized practitioners, only scattered fragments held by individuals, disconnected from each other, trying to reconstruct something they were never meant to see in full. And that raises the final question inside the body of this investigation. Not what was lost, not when it disappeared, but why every trace of it had to be removed at the exact same moment in history. So now, we're left standing in the aftermath of something we were never meant to notice. The buildings are gone, the bells are gone, the records, incomplete, scattered, or silent exactly where they should speak the loudest. And in their place, a system that feels so normal, so unquestioned, that most people never think to ask what came before it, or why it had to disappear so completely. Because this isn't just about hospitals, it's about how reality is constructed, how one system can be removed, and another installed, without leaving behind a visible argument, without a public transition, without resistance recorded in the history books. It's about how something can exist, function, and then be erased so thoroughly that even asking about it feels strange, but the questions remain. Why did the architectural design of healing spaces shift so abruptly from environments that interacted with the human body to buildings that simply deliver substances? Why were the bells, the one element that appears again and again across continents, specifically removed, melted, and stripped of their context? Why does the timeline between the late 1800s and the early 1900s show the same pattern everywhere, regardless of language, culture, or political system? And why, when you start pulling on any one of these threads, do you keep arriving at the same conclusion? That something was not just replaced, it was erased. Not forgotten over time, not lost through neglect, but removed, deliberately, completely, and all at once. And maybe the most unsettling question of all is this: if an entire system of knowledge, one that may have used sound, structure, and frequency as a form of healing, could be dismantled and wiped from the official record, then what else are we standing inside right now that only exists because something before it had to be destroyed first?